Welcome to another deep dive, and this time we're tackling Uniquely Human by Dr. Barry Prizant. Really fascinating stuff about autism and kind of challenging some common misconceptions.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Prizant, he really takes a different approach.
Yeah.
It's not about like viewing autism as like an illness you got to fix or a problem. It's more like a different way of being human.
Yeah, and he doesn't waste any time. Like right away he throws you right into the deep end with the story about a school principal. This
Yeah.
principal is told he's going to have a student with autism, and his response is, "Should I be scared to death?"
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I mean, talk about, I don't know, I guess for a lot of parents and educators, that might be a common, you know,
Feeling.
yeah, like fear, bewilderment, anxiety, all that.
And it's that fear, right, that makes people think that they need to fix autistic people. Like get rid of autistic behaviors.
Right. And what Prizant does that's so interesting is he kind of flips the script. He says, no, these aren't, behaviors we need to get rid of. These are just human behaviors. They're just expressed differently.
Totally. He interviews this woman, Roz Blackburn. She's autistic, and she describes it as just being excited more easily than other people, which is
Yeah.
why she might, jump up and down or flap her arms.
I mean, we've all been there.
Exactly. We all do those things, just maybe not to the same degree.
That's such a great point. It really makes you think about how we're judging things, I guess. But okay, so if we're not trying to fix these behaviors, then what does that mean for how we actually interact with autistic individuals?
Well, Present, he's really big on figuring out the why. Like, why is this behavior happening?
Mm.
Instead of just saying, oh, that's bad or that's autistic, we got to dig a little deeper.
Yeah. And he has this great example. He talks about Jesse, this little boy who is labeled as having like huge behavior problems, like really severe. And it turned out that he was just super sensitive to loud noises, to being touched, things like that. So all these so-called problem behaviors were actually just his way of reacting to, sensory overload and fear.
Yeah, I can see that.
And once they understood his communication needs, they put in some supports to help him with the sensory stuff. And Jesse went from like this anxious, withdrawn kid to actually thriving in school.
That's amazing.
It is. But, this kind of brings us to another really fascinating thing that Prizant talks about, and that's echolalia.
Oh, yeah.
This is something that I think a lot of people see as like kind of a meaningless quirk. They see autistic people repeating phrases or sounds, and it's like, oh, that's just part of autism. But Prizant, he argues that it's actually a form of communication.
Yeah. And he has this really great story. There's this boy, David, who mostly communicated through echolalia. Like that was his main way of talking.
Yeah.
And at first everyone thought he was just like randomly repeating things. But then they figured out that David was like super into sponges, like fascinated with them.
Really?
Yeah, and all the Kelly was actually him like expressing how excited he was about sponges. It
Yeah.
was like totally purposeful and meaningful, even if, it wasn't obvious at first.
That's a great example. It makes you think about like what we think of as meaningful communication,
Exactly. And what's even more interesting is that Prizant's research actually breaks echolalia down into different types. So there's some that's like requesting things, some that's expressing emotions, some that's even for self-regulation. So like what we might hear and think is just like random noise could actually be this whole complex form of communication going on.
It's like you might think, oh, this kid's just repeating stuff, but they could be trying to tell you something really important. Huh. This is making me think about those times when, maybe you dismiss a kid's echolalia. You're like, oh, they're just, but what if you're missing something?
That's exactly what Prizant's saying. Like,
Yeah.
we got to be paying attention, really listening to what autistic people are trying to tell us, even if it's not how we expect them to say it.
Yeah. And this actually kind of ties into what he says about enthusiasms,
Mm.
those really intense interests that a lot of autistic kids have. Some people see these as like obsessions and think, oh, we got to stop that. But Prizant has a totally different take.
Oh, yeah. He sees them as like super valuable.
Yeah.
Like they can provide comfort and predictability and a sense of control
Mhm.
in a world that can be like really overwhelming for these kids.
And he tells this great story. There's this boy, Alexander, who was like the king of car washes.
Oh, wow.
Like that was his thing. He loved car washes so much that he ended up going to this like car wash convention in Las Vegas. Can you imagine?
Oh, that's so cool.
It is. And like think about the joy, the sense of accomplishment. That would never have happened if everyone had just been like, oh, Alexander, stop talking about car washes.
Totally. And there's another one, Chad. He was like obsessed with sprinklers. Yeah.
Sprinklers.
And by the time he was 8, he was like an expert on all the different brands and models. It's amazing how like something that seems like just an interest can turn into like this huge knowledge base.
Yeah, I mean, it really challenges us to think about those intense interests differently. Instead of trying to like fit them into what we think is appropriate, maybe we can figure out how to like nurture them and help them grow.
For sure.
But I mean, of course, like with anything, there are going to be, challenges with these enthusiasms.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Like one thing is, sometimes kids might talk about their interest like all the time,
Right.
which can make it hard to have a, like back and forth conversation, especially in social
Yeah,
situations.
I can see that.
But Prizant says, don't just shut it down completely. Like for some kids, it's a way to like self-regulate, to feel comfortable.
Hmm.
Maybe we can just help them figure out like how to express their enthusiasm in a way that works for everyone.
So it's like finding that balance, I guess.
Yeah.
And this actually leads into something else that Prizant talks about, which is it's about trust and fear and control, like how all these things are connected.
Yeah, it gets really interesting here.
Yeah, he talks about how for a lot of autistic people, unexpected changes can be so stressful, like really stressful.
Yeah.
And that can lead to anxiety, to feeling like they need to control their environment, to control the
It's
situation.
like that story he tells about Derek. Derek was a kid who thrived on routine. And even a small change, like, Prizant coming to visit a couple weeks later than usual, that was enough to make him anxious.
It just shows how important that trust is, like knowing what to expect, having that predictability. There's actually a quote, Present quotes his friend Michael John Carley, who has Asperger's.
Mhm.
Carley says, the opposite of anxiety isn't calm, it's trust.
Wow. Yeah, I love that.
Right. And it's not just like changes in their schedule, it's also like physical sensations. Prizant talks about how something like, I don't know, a cold, which most of us won't even think about, could be scary for an autistic person because they don't have that experience to understand what those feelings are, you know?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So it's like those behaviors that we might think are extreme, we might think they're overreacting, but it could just be that they're reacting to fear, to not having that control.
Totally. And he tells this story about Dennis. Dennis had this huge meltdown at an amusement park because a ride was closed unexpectedly.
Oh.
And for Dennis, who really relied on knowing what to expect, that was like this major betrayal.
Yeah. It makes you realize how much we take for granted.
For sure. And because of this need for control, you often see autistic people developing rituals, doing things that help them feel safe, talking a lot about a favorite topic, lining up objects, even being picky about food. It's all about creating a sense of order.
So it's not just like being weird or difficult, it's actually serving a purpose.
Right. So maybe instead of trying to get rid of those behaviors, we can find ways to help them, manage their anxiety, feel more secure.
That's interesting. And this actually ties in perfectly with what Prizant says about emotional memory, right?
Oh, yeah.
He explains how these like past negative experiences, they can have such a huge impact on autistic people, like a really overwhelming impact.
Yeah, it can be hard for them to let go of that.
He talks about this boy, Billy. Billy was terrified of needles, and it wasn't just the pain of the needle itself, it was the memory of a bad experience he had before, and he just couldn't shake it. And I imagine, if you're trying to reason with a child who's like in that moment reliving that emotional memory, it's got to be so hard. They're not thinking logically.
No, it's all like pure emotion.
Exactly. And so Prizant, he says, instead of trying to argue with them, acknowledge their experience, validate what they're feeling, provide support for emotional regulation, and maybe even try to create some positive emotional memories to like counterbalance the negative ones.
Yeah, I like that.
He even mentions how some dentists are using like visual aids and playful approaches to make autistic kids feel more comfortable during dental visits.
Oh, that's great.
It's like just a little bit of understanding and creativity can make such a huge difference.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking of understanding, one of the biggest challenges for a lot of autistic people is navigating the social world.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. And that's actually a perfect place to pick up when we come back for part 2.
It's like, imagine, you walk into a cafeteria and everyone seems to know exactly what to do, where to go, but you have no clue. Like, where do you even start? That's how Prizant describes what the social world can feel like for an autistic person.
That's a really good analogy. I can see how that would be like so overwhelming and confusing. But what is it about social interaction that makes it so hard, specifically for autistic people? Is it that they just like don't pick up on the unspoken rules?
Well, one thing is a lot of autistic people, they tend to be very literal in how they interpret language. So things like sarcasm, metaphors, idioms, those can be really confusing because the words don't actually mean what they're saying.
So all those subtle cues that we kind of rely on, they might not even register.
Exactly. And Prizant, he tells this story about this boy, Philip, who accidentally cut in line at the movies. And when someone told him there was a line, he was genuinely confused
Hmm.
because no one had told him he couldn't stand there.
It makes sense. He was just following the rules as he knew them. But I can see how that would lead to like a lot of misunderstandings.
Oh, totally. And it's not just about understanding the rules. There's also this whole layer of like unspoken social cues and expectations that can be really tough to figure out.
Yeah. Prizant mentions this boy, Eli, who actually thought that neurotypical people could read minds.
Oh, wow.
That's how he explained it, yeah. It was the only way he could make sense of how everyone else seemed to just know what to do in social situations.
It's kind of sad when you think about it. Like he felt so out of sync with everyone else.
And I bet it creates so much stress and anxiety, constantly feeling like you're missing something, not quite getting it. No wonder so many autistic people have social anxiety.
Yeah, for sure. And this difficulty with the social stuff, it can also affect them in school because a lot of the learning environment depends on those same unspoken cues and dynamics.
Like Prizant talks about this boy, Ned, who got upset because the teacher didn't call on him even though he was raising his hand.
Oh, right. He'd learned the rule, but he didn't get the nuances of when that rule doesn't apply.
Exactly. So it's really important for teachers to understand those nuances and be able to explain them.
Yeah. You got to anticipate those potential problems
Yeah.
and provide clear guidance, especially in those trickier social situations.
And we can't forget about emotional regulation, right? That plays such a huge role in social interaction.
Oh, yeah.
Prizant tells this story about Benny. Benny got suspended from school for pushing the principal during a fire drill.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and at first you're like, whoa, that's a pretty extreme reaction. But it turns out that Benny was already feeling anxious that day. Then the fire alarm went off, which was probably sensory overload for him. And then he saw the principal yelling at other kids.
So it wasn't just like aggression, it was a reaction to everything that was happening around him.
Right. It's like it's always important to remember that behavior is communication. And this really highlights how important it is to have strategies in place, environments that support autistic people in regulating their emotions,
Mm,
especially when things get really stressful.
for sure. And this kind of leads into one of Prezant's biggest points, which is that we need more people who just get it. People who have that natural ability to connect with autistic people in a way that builds trust and understanding.
He calls it the it factor.
Yeah, the it factor. It's not about like having special training or anything. It's just this way of being.
So what does that actually look like? What are the qualities that these people have?
Well, Prezant says a few things like they see the person, not the diagnosis.
Hmm.
They understand that autistic behaviors are just human behaviors expressed differently. They're attuned to the person's emotional state. They don't try to control them. And they often use humor, to lighten things up, to build that positive relationship.
Yeah. And he has all these great examples, like this music therapist who imitated a cat's meow to connect with a nonverbal child, or this gym teacher who like incorporated a student's love of US presidents into their workout routine. It's like they're meeting these kids where they are.
Exactly. And they realize that empowering autistic people means giving them choices, building on their strengths, and celebrating who they are.
He also talks about this special ed director who would actually do home visits to connect with families and make them feel more comfortable.
It's about going the extra mile to build those relationships.
Yeah. And it's not just about, fixing problems. It's about helping these kids grow and reach their full potential.
For sure. And that actually kind of leads into what Prizant says about empowering families. He really encourages parents to trust their instincts and to advocate for their kids.
Because, as he points out, parents know their children best.
Exactly. Like
Oh.
they're the experts.
And he tells this great story about David and Susan, who took their sons, both of whom have autism, on this like really challenging hike. It was 9 miles.
Wow.
Yeah. And they'd talked to this expert who'd said, oh no, the boys won't be able to handle it.
Oh, really?
But David and Susan, they trusted their gut, and guess what? The boys not only finished the hike, they loved it.
That's amazing.
It just shows sometimes you gotta trust your instincts.
Totally. And Prizant also talks about how important it is to find those supportive communities, where families feel like they belong.
It can be so isolating when you're dealing with something that a lot of people don't understand.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not just about finding support. It's about like seeking out the positive.
Yeah.
Prizant talks about avoiding what one father called the doom and gloom crowd, the people who only focus on the negative stuff.
Instead, surround yourself with people who give you hope, who celebrate the good things, who remind you that your child is more than just a diagnosis.
That's so important.
Yeah, and that's a perfect segue into the next section of the book, which is all about answering those common questions that parents and professionals have. And actually, it's a good place to stop for now. We'll dive into that more when we come back for the final part of our deep dive.
Yeah, that question really got me thinking, what if, instead of thinking about autism as something to be fixed, we tried to appreciate the unique perspectives and abilities that autistic people bring?
That's exactly what Prizant was saying. He wants
Yeah.
us to challenge those ideas of like what's normal and realize that, different ways of thinking and behaving, that's a good thing, not a bad thing.
And he has some really cool stories about autistic people who are successful and happy. And a lot of times it's because they've embraced their unique ways of seeing the world.
Like Ross Blackburn, we talked about her before. She travels all over talking about her experiences. She's
Oh,
become this big advocate for autistic people, challenging how society sees them and encouraging people to see things from an autistic point of view. It's awesome how she's used her own experiences to make a difference. And Prizant also talks about Michael John Carley, who used his diagnosis to start GRIASP, which is this big organization that supports autistic adults.
yeah. Michael's story shows that people with autism can really change things,
Yeah.
for themselves and for others.
Yeah. It's inspiring to see them not just doing well, but like leading the way.
Absolutely.
And then there's Stephen Shore. He's another guy who's done amazing things. He's a professor, a musician, an author.
It's like proof that you can embrace your abilities and find your place in the world.
What I find interesting about all these stories is it's not about overcoming autism, you know?
Right.
It's about figuring out how to be yourself, how to contribute in your own way.
Exactly. Autism isn't something to be fixed or cured. It's part of who they are, and it's often what makes them so special.
And that brings us back to that bigger question that Prizant asks, right? What if, instead of trying to make autistic people fit into our world, we tried to understand their world?
It really makes you think, what if we stopped focusing on what we see as deficits and started celebrating the fact that people experience the world in different ways?
So, as we're wrapping up this deep dive into uniquely human, what can our listeners take away from this? How can they use this in their own lives?
Maybe it's about being more curious when you meet an autistic person, really listening to them.
Yeah.
Maybe it's about challenging your own assumptions.
Maybe it's about finding ways to connect with autistic people, hearing their stories, or maybe it's just, taking a moment to appreciate that everyone's different.
Exactly. Hopefully this deep dive has helped people see autism in a new light, move past the fear and the misunderstandings.
To a place of empathy and appreciation
Yeah,
and believing in everyone's potential.
absolutely.
Well, thanks for joining us on this journey. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.